with me today is Nicole Dickson. Nikki, welcome. I'm so happy to be speaking with you today, actually. We have had many conversations, many conversations over the last few years. We've come to know each other. And I'm very much aware that this conversation is going to be special. And initially, I was going to read out a kind of official biography, and I thought, that's quite strange within the spirit of narrative practices. And I thought, I'll just let you introduce yourself, and then we take the conversation from there.
All right, thank you very much. It's good to be in this space with you and with everybody else on a Friday afternoon. Great way to start the weekend. So true to narrative ideas, I really embrace the idea that I live a multi-storied life. Perhaps first and foremost, I'm a lover of stories. Stories I think have always informed my life, stories of tradition and heritage. I was born British. I've chosen to be South African. And as a result of kind of this love of stories, I really do surround myself with books. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a family who really believed in the value of reading. And I have many wonderful memories of library day, the days once a week when the traveling library would visit our little village. And so to share a secret with you, I still love reading children's books, except nowadays I buy them for myself. And then I guess to say that I work as a pastoral narrative therapist, really passionate about narrative therapy and the ways of being. I'm married to Graham. This year we will be honoring 30 years of marriage. I'm a mother to two adult children, Courtney and Luke. And they are actually two of the most influential teachers I've ever had in my life. I'm also a daughter, a sister, and a friend. I have a sense of rootedness in my faith as a Christian. I surround myself with art and music and the practice of yoga. I love taking photographs and documenting life through the lens. And I guess I'm an eternal learner. And so that's kind of a statement of position, I think, that supports who I am and the therapeutic work that I do, the teachings that I offer, the people I spend time with. And I guess it also influences my intention to keep studying and learning. There's kind of a maxim that I hold on to, which says something along the lines of never stop learning because life never stops teaching. And so I believe that's true for people and for life stories too.
Yeah, I never stop learning, because I suppose the other way around is that if I stop learning, life will continue teaching and it will surprise me by the lessons that it offers me. Yeah, I like that. I like that idea. So that it sounds like there's an intentionality in your positioning yourself as a learner, as a perpetual learner, as opposed to just surrendering to what life offers you.
Absolutely.
So there's a receptivity.
Yeah.
Wow. I suppose that's the place to really take the conversation to. You mentioned that you love stories, and it's the written stories, it's the poetic stories, and I know that because I've experienced you in that way. It's also the stories that people tell in the context that you work in. And you've just given us a little bit of a story about yourself. And could you just reflect on what the story that you've told us about yourself signifies?
I think it's important for me that my story signifies what in narrative we call a preferred identity, a preferred story. And within that, it's also the space I need to honor the different roles that I play and the different important relationships that inform who I am and allow me to be who I am as well. And that is the relationship with Graham, my husband, and with Courtney and Luke. And so those are significant relationships for me.
Mm, mm. So that story is carefully chosen. I mean, you've carefully chosen that story to represent who you aspire to become, and as a preferred way of being.
Mm, mm. And all of that is in line with good narrative practices and ideas.
Mm, mm, mm. So, I mean, I like stories too. I like to tell stories. I'm not a fantastic storyteller somehow, but I love to. I just enjoy stories. As a little kid, I I always hung around storytellers.
Mm,
There's something about people that can tell a story and tell it so well.
mm, mm,
And yet, in the context that we are in, we're speaking about specific stories. These are stories that have enormous import and energy that drives how people interact with the world. So it's the way they construct the world, and how that interaction between their construct and the world outside of them, that intersection, in
mm,
if that's a way of speaking about it.
mm,
What about that? What about that inspires you and inspires your work?
mm. I think it's the idea that each person has a story to tell, and that oftentimes in the world around us, the influence of the world is so huge on who we think we need to be, and what is impressed on us, that sometimes we're not telling the authentic story of, um, for example, of who I really am. And that often then marginalizes that authentic story in a sense. And some of the world's dominant stories seem to take preference. And those dominant stories could be those that were curated within our family of origin, our culture. And so there's something about the idea that people have these stories that I can witness, I can bear witness to, that is really, for me, really life-giving in work.
Mm, mm. So those the marginalized stories and the stories that are left in the peripheries of people's focus, and you use the word witnessing. How how are you understanding that word?
Mm. So it's a term that I first encountered in the work of Kate Weingarten, who's a psychologist in America, and she does a lot of narrative work as well. And she takes on a statement of positioning herself as a compassionate witness to the marginalized and the painful and hurting stories of the world around. And I think that really struck a key with me, because within the context of narrative, I know that I don't get to direct conversations, and I don't get to fix or give advice, but it then does invite me to come alongside, almost in what Heather Plett, when we chatted to her last year, that whole idea of being the bowl or the container, the safe container in which stories can unfold and be heard. And the real gift that is then to witness that, to witness a person becoming or unfolding in a new and a preferred way. yeah, that witness is a very powerful word for me. To be able to watch, to be able to see, to hear, to be present to. It's kind of become, as I think I mentioned earlier, it's become one of my kind of statements of position in terms of the work. It's just witness, bear witness, acknowledge, see. I notice you, I see you, I hear your story.
And some people, I have heard some people referring to that that practice of witnessing as a gaze. I'm thinking of myself as a child, and somehow as a child I always had this sense that I was in my parents' gaze, whether they were seeing me or not. And the moment I noticed that I was in my parents' gaze, there was a freedom about my play. There was a freedom about my exploration. There was a freedom about how I walked, how I played with my mates, just not knowing that there's this this gaze.
I guess for me, there's another part of that as well, because sometimes a parental gaze could intimate you're doing wrong, and I'm watching you, waiting for you to figure that out as well. Whereas witnessing is just being available to all of that person with all of me and all that I have, in the context of a therapy session.
Right. That's yeah, I like that. That's interesting. And what brought you? How would you describe your coming to narrative therapy?
I first encountered narrative therapy just over 20 years ago when I was doing my honors in psychology, and it was one of the postmodern ways of thinking that I was introduced to. And I'm very fortunate to have my first narrative teacher as part of the circle today, Sue Skidmore. Trevor Hudson and Sue Skidmore had developed the Pastoral Care Centre at Northfield Methodist Church, a local church congregation, and they were offering training in narrative. And I think it was a way of being that I fell in love with. So I often speak of having this passionate love affair with narrative therapy, just because it allows me to be so fully who I am in conversation. But it also empowers the person that I'm with. I don't want to take on the responsibility of diagnosing and fixing and assessing and telling people what to do. And so narrative stands against all of that and embraces that person as the expert in their own life. And I think that was one of the ideas that really struck me in those early years, that the person that I'm with is already an expert and doesn't need any advice from me. So I think that is one of the ideas that really stood against everything that I was learning within modernist or other models of psychology. And that really caught my eye. And then I suppose it was also about the ways that I could be a collaborator with somebody in their journey with a problem or a dominant story, rather than being a fixer. Because I had a relationship with Mrs. Fix-It before I met narrative. So that kind of changed the whole dynamic for me.
would you like to say a little bit about Mrs. Fixer?
I think it's a position that I long held within my family as the oldest sister, of always needing to be the older, the wiser sibling in particular. And then the kind of the whole social discourse around therapy is that in general, people expect the therapist to have an answer for every problem, to be able to direct the person to a better narrative or a better decision-making process. And that's, I guess there was a part of me that in my younger years would have bought into that idea that I needed to be the expert. And so it was liberating to discover and to explore that idea that actually I wasn't. The only person I could be an expert in is my own life. And that's something that has really stayed with me as being quite a significant idea. And so, yeah, from there, really changed the focus, stayed within a pastoral context, I think, because for me, stories of faith or spirituality are as intrinsic to well-being as stories of the body and stories of the mind. So that whole idea of separating, body, mind, and soul also didn't sit well with me. And so then I just continued my studies within the narrative arena, narrative framework.
And so what I'm hearing is that you having been the first born child within a very particular dominant narrative, it seemed like you were early on socialized into being a fixer. You were fixing, and then you describe finding narrative therapy as having given you a certain freedom from that. How is that possible to find that? How was it possible for you to find that connection between not just what you were reading, but internalizing what you were reading, what you were meeting in your studies and in your learning, and allowing that to impact you as a person? Because there's so many people, so many of us read things, we meet ideas, and they just remain ideas.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I remember sitting in the training with Sue and the team. In fact, Heather Griffin was also one of those people who was part of that training that I did. And exploring the idea of the older sister and almost the mantle of responsibility that had been given to me by my birth physician and by my parents, in terms of, you're the oldest, they're watching what you're doing, you need to behave because they're going to be following from what you do, and kind of realizing in my late 20s that didn't fit. That mantle didn't fit. It was almost, it was marginalizing Nikki's own voice. Who said that I had to be the responsible one just because I was the oldest? Who said that I always had to do the right thing, and that I couldn't be the rebel just because of the expectations placed on my shoulders? And so, yeah, just to be made aware of that narrative or that label with the expectations that went along with it was really, really liberating. So much so that I actually, I wrote letters, and I never gave it to them at the time, but I wrote 2 letters of resignation, and I resigned from being the big sister, the older sister, the wise, the person always does the right thing. You know, I actually resigned from that. And I think that's where my the sense of liberation came from.
So there's actually an acting out of an idea as opposed to just liking an idea. So you took an active act, and you actually took the step to step into a new way of being, as opposed to just staying with, oh, I like this idea, and maybe and then what? Because for most people, that's always where the huge leap comes in. It's a huge leap from having a sense of what I want to be, or how I want to do my life, how I want to live my life, and actually taking that step, and 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 stepping into the authenticity of how I want to live. It can for some people be both frightening, and because there are so many other elements of existential elements that are in place. So, and that's why I'm really curious about this step, because for me, I find it very useful to speak about these they're courageous acts, because for most people, their actual resistances might be coming from, well, maybe I don't, if I step out of here, I'm going to be alone. If I step out of here, I'm not going to be fed. If I step out of this idea, that 1, 2, 3 things will not happen.
And it's almost in line with a lot of the narrative intention, is to almost find counter stories or acts of resistance to stand against a dominant narrative. So perhaps, you know, the responsibility of being the older sister was quite burdensome. And so writing the resignation letters, resigning from being the older sister, was a real act of resistance to what was expected of me by my family, and probably by the world, in terms of what a big sister's role is in a family.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very hopeful. Listening to that, I'm extremely hopeful, because I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I can do that too. I can allow myself to step into my courageous space and take that step, because it is true. Echo. So it is true that there are things that there's a truth that I want to live into, and sometimes there's a conflict between where I am and where I want to be, and I'm almost always negotiating that space between where I am and where I want to be.
Yes.
And to hear how you have negotiated yourself, and giving that example of what you actually had to do, in a way, it speaks to what some people refer to as micro experiments, doing little experiments, taking little steps towards eventually getting into that space, writing that letter, but not really sending it. But the intention is that I need to break away from this conflict that I'm living with at the moment, because it's not allowing me to be my authentic self.
And so within that story, recognizing that there are alternative stories. I can, you know, to use narrative terms, I can re-author my story into a preferred way of being.
And just staying on this a little bit, because I work with with young people who come and they'll say, I want to change, but I don't know how to change.
Mm.
Um, and just bringing this whole idea of intentionality and moving towards my preferred narrative or my preferred story. Is there something there about also negotiating the spaces, identifying people that would support you
Mm.
as you navigate your way into your preferred story?
Mm. Absolutely. And if we're speaking about narrative talks about remembering conversations. So who is it in your life that knows this about you, that knows your heart's desire? And what would they say? And so creating around the person almost a structure of support, a circle of support around the preferred or the alternative story. There's an exercise we use in narrative called the Club of Life. And we always work through it in our training. And so if I was able in my own club of life to invite people to join the club, who would I invite to join? And who would I ask to leave? And who would gate crash? You know, who would turn up anyway? And so looking at my social community and who are the important people in it? Who are the people that I suppose we would speak about, this person really gets me, you know, so who are those people that would support me in an alternative story, or who know me and know my heart's desires and would be therefore be supportive. So creating that. We also talk about outsider witnesses or reflecting teams, but that whole idea that I don't exist in isolation. So I'm informed by the world around me, but then within that, I'm also able to choose sometimes who those people are that would support my alternative story.
Because in some way that lessens the fear of isolation, isn't it? Because if I'm living out a particular narrative, that narrative becomes my identity. And so leaving that identity is into a preferred identity is a huge leap to the extent that there are relationships that I'm going to lose in the process. There are situations that are going to be left behind. And so knowing that there are people waiting for me on the other side, there are people that might come with me on the other side towards my preferred story, lessens the anxiety of being alone, of being isolated. That I still have a community of support.
Yes.
Mm, mm, mm. That's so good. That's so good. Yeah, I'm thinking now already that if there's anybody who is in that space, for them to begin to think about how do I move forward? Who is coming along with me? I'm thinking of the story of Jesus. When he turned to his disciples in that difficult moment, and he said to them, "Are you also going away?" So yeah, thank you for that.
Okay. You're welcome.
And you are a co-founder of I4CC. You're directly responsible at the moment with the daily running of I4CC. Could you give us an idea of what I4CC brings into the world?
I think there's a couple of things. I think firstly, we really bring, as I4CC and as the team, almost an intention to explore ways of weaving narrative therapy, narrative ideas into or alongside with pastoral theology. So I like to speak about it of creating a narrative of care that embodies all is a total embodiment, body, mind, and soul. And I think we try and do that with the courses, the training that we offer, the conversations, listening to the world around us through our listening groups, listening circles. And I think secondly, we try and bring a level of professionalism to working in community centers, working for nonprofits, working in faith communities, that I really feel every single person we encounter is entitled to. You know, there are not enough psychologists per capita in our country. That's a fact. So where do people go? And people who can't afford that level of professional therapy, where do people like that go? How do we then make accessible to people meaningful, respectful, genuine interest conversations? Because everybody we encounter is as deserving of that as the person on medical aid who can afford you know, to go and see a psychologist. And that's a serious responsibility, and it's one that we take it seriously, because we are working with the stories of people's lives. So I think there's an interface there of training other community centers, other pastoral care centers in offering, using volunteers who are committed to a process of learning, who are committed to a process of honoring ethical ways of being with someone, and who are committed to being responsible for their actions through supervision. And so that's some of what we bring to the world, I think. Creating spaces, conversations to happen is important. I almost, yeah, I think that collaborated space where nobody is an expert, but we can all learn from one another's stories is one of the ways that we can influence our, you know, the world around us.
Mm. And so you train, I4CC trains people. I4CC trains people into this act, the act of listening and the act of witnessing, and all these elements that you're talking about, and hoping that those people that train in that particular way also go into the communities and live out their lives in this way. I have heard you use the expression, a way of being in the world, that narrative gives you a way of being in the world. Well, just say a little bit more about that, and what would you be inviting people who are thinking about training in this particular way of being in the world?
So it's Michael White, one of the co-founders of narrative therapy, actually speaks of, he's no longer with us, but he speaks, or he wrote about, narrative is not just a model of therapy or a way of therapy that we have in our toolbox, but rather it is a worldview and a lifestyle. So it invites me wherever I am to be mindful of somebody else's story, to be mindful of the ways in which the world around me plays a role and plays influence. It helps me to hear the marginalized story, to center the person's needs that I'm with. Yeah, so I think that's quite an important part of. So I never switch off narrative ways of questioning or how I listen to people. It's always with me wherever I am, even with my children. Yeah, so in that sense, it's a more of a lifestyle. How can I be more fully present to the world around me, a very hurting, dysfunctional world? How can I be present to that in a way that one person might feel their story's been heard? even if it is my teenager, you know, in a bad moment, or my child, how can I listen? How can I really hear what might need to be said?
So if I'm a CEO of a big company, of a big corporate organization, what have I got to do with narrative ideas and practices?
It's quite surprising you say that. A lot of my colleagues actually use narrative in the field of coaching and organizational work, where they actually meet with big corporates and people in leadership positions and people who work in warehousing, and that whole idea of that modernist idea of being parts of a machine that doesn't have to have a name, we can have an employee number, kind of depersonalizes, really marginalizes the individuals within that organization. And so even if it is about inviting a different way of conversation or talking to each other, or a different way of exploring conflict in an organization, there's just some sort of key values that are really helpful, regardless of the space or the context that we work in.
I can see how narrative practices and ideas can work in the context of interpersonal relationships and even in parents and children. Maybe if I'm a CEO who comes from a very particular orientation that believes that I am the boss and only my voice counts in this room, and I'm thinking, are you giving me ideas around narrative practices that are going to emasculate me, or whatever it is, that idea of a circular conversation, a very humanistic understanding of organizations? I don't really like that idea. You know, so how then do we work with those ideas that are heavily entrenched in our psyche, in our collective psyche, about hierarchies, and we see them a lot in our societies. The hierarchies that are entrenched in our living together, you know, that are very patriarchal.
Well, I think that one of the first things we do is we start to make those systems visible. You know, a lot of those ways of being, or those systems of the hierarchy, patriarchy, a lot of them are so taken for granted that they're almost invisible. And so when we start making them no longer visible, and inviting people to speak about the effects of those systems on them, whether it's in a workplace or a family environment, I think those can be helpful conversations in terms of, if I listen differently, what might the results be, the outcome be in terms of my staff, or how might my teams respond to me differently if I ask a question in a different way. So definitely in that sense, telling the stories of organizations, you know, the history and how it's been done in the past, and inviting in worker stories and what they might require from the company, the organization as well. So it kind of places a greater sense of common ground on the table, and that's in the experiences that we've had has been really, really helpful, just to make those invisible stories visible, invisible stories of marginalization or hierarchy, as you mentioned, just to make those visible.
Mm. Oh, I'm also hearing from what you just said here. I'm thinking, as you mentioned, I'm thinking that while individuals have their own personal stories, it's also possible that organizations have their stories that need to
Mm.
be to be told and to be heard and to be witnessed too. And
Mm.
in the same way as individuals have their preferred stories, organizations too could have their preferred stories and pretty much do the same journey
Mm.
from where the story is now to the preferred story.
That's right. What are the problems? What
Mm,
does it require from all of us in an organization to start reimagining um, what would make a difference, what this organization could look like, what would be more productive, or et cetera, et cetera.
mm. And I'm thinking about your use of the metaphor. You wrote an article last year called the Midwife, a narrative feminist metaphor for pastoral and self-care during
Mhm.
COVID-19. And in that article, I'm going to quote what you wrote. I have been a witness, and we've spoken a little bit about witnessing to people's
Mm.
stories for more than 20 years now. That's quite somebody's lifetime, eh?
Mm. Mm.
You see, as a pastoral narrative therapist, I'm in the business of listening to stories, gathering stories, and bearing witness to the birth of new stories. I
Mm.
like the way you use the metaphors of birthing, and you just referred to bearing new stories, and
Mm.
individuals as much as organizations can do that.
Mm.
And uh, I, I, I'm interested in hearing what drove you to writing this article that is full of beautiful metaphors, and the metaphors themselves are not ordinary metaphors that a person like myself who identifies as male would
Mm.
almost gravitate towards, and yet they're very attractive and they're beautiful, powerful metaphors.
Mm. Mm. So I think obviously as a woman, it's a metaphor that is sort of part of um, my body's story, the whole birthing experience, or the possibility of a birthing experience. Um, and I think it was also about the waiting in those initial stages of lockdown, kind of that liminal space that we all, to some extent, but I'll speak for myself, that I found myself in. The journey from what was to what is currently to what will be, and the what will be is yet unknown. So there was kind of this transition almost. And the more I thought about it, it reminded me of the transition from not having a child to kind of that pregnant expectancy journey. And it's funny that you mention about people who identify as male, because or masculine. One of my colleagues, after he read my article, actually commented, um, uh, shared with me his discovery that it was actually Socrates that first introduced the metaphor of midwife in describing a philosophical awakening that he engaged in with his fellow Grecians, who were all male, of course. And he actually writes, if I could quote, he wrote this in 150 BC. My art of midwifery is in general like theirs, in brackets, real midwives. The only difference is that my patients are men, not women, and my concern is not with the body, but with the soul that is in travail of birth. So I think that's quite sort of poignant, that men are also in spaces of transition right now, are experiencing a sense of expectancy and the labor pains just as much. It almost transcends, the gender, the idea of gender. Um, and Julian of Norwich, whose writings I really enjoy, she suggests that we allow our wounds to become the womb when new life is conceived. And so I think all of those beautiful metaphors together, regardless of masculinity or femininity, speak to this time that we're living in.
Mm. Mm. I'm just reminded, I think it may have been Julian of Norwich who poses a question about what does God do all day long? And God lies on a labor bed in one act of giving birth.
Mm.
So yeah, it's quite an interesting connection, because why I was interested in that is I'm increasingly becoming aware that I'm not just a person giving birth to ideas, that I'm actually invited to give birth to society, to give birth to community. Yeah, and the metaphors invite me to think differently about my work here on earth, and about my purpose. Because ordinary speak doesn't do that. You know, when people are talking about just purposeful living, and it tends to be, for me at least, speaking for myself, it tends to be all about productivity, doing, activity, whereas the birthing is a process that begins with expectancy.
Creation.
Yeah. Mm. 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 What what have got metaphors to do with narrative practices?
Narrative invites the use of metaphors, perhaps like a lot of other models of therapy would, but almost in a sense that where there are no words for me to express how I feel or what my experience has been, most times I'm able to do that through a metaphor, through an image, through a picture. So in that sense, it helps me to find words for my own experience.
Mm. Mm. And these metaphors are essentially, if we went back to when you talked about positioning myself, or positioning yourself as a therapist, as an accompanier, these are metaphors that a person is allowed to, not necessarily allowed, I don't want to use the word allowed, but these are narratives, these are metaphors that a person chooses to use.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there any particular narrative idea that captures you every time?
I think I would have to say externalization. Externalization is a practice that is narrative. It doesn't belong to any other ways of being or forms of therapy or models. And to see what happens to someone when they're invited to take a dominant story or a problem almost outside of themselves, and to be able to look at it, look at its behaviors, look at its influence on their lives, the history, where it came from, to see people transition from I'm the problem to this is the problem that's residing with me, is I think some of the most we speak about sparkling moments in narrative therapy. Some of those moments where a light bulb, for example, to use the metaphor of a light bulb, just switches on. when people start to realize that they are not the problem. You know, so somebody living with depression is not depressed, they are more than depressed. They are still somebody's sibling, or they're still a parent. They still love doing certain things. So the whole idea of totalizing somebody is removed by externalizing. And sometimes in narrative, we would even invite the person to consider what it might look like if they were to draw it. You know, what color would it be? How big would it be on the page? Where would you be in relationship to the depression? And I'm sensing we've lost Nsamu, so I think that would definitely be one element of narrative that is fun to work with. It's exciting to be able to explore with people who come into conversation, and is one that has had the most liberating effect on a lot of people that I've met with. Are you back?
Yeah, so sorry, I'm back.
Yeah, I just continue to share a little bit more about the power of externalization in liberating somebody who feels marginalized in relation to a problem.
Because myself, one of the difficulties that I've had to experience in my life, in my short years, is that I almost always attached myself, my identity, to my experiences. And when that experience, when the experience is unpleasant, I always attach that to me as me being terrible. I am awful. And the world around does the same thing. It tells me the same story. Oh, you're awful for having done this. You're terrible for having done that. And I'm going around living with enormous amount of shame because that behavior or whatever situation that I may be going through is attached to me as a person.
Yes. Yeah. And so being able to separate it from me so that it's no longer totalizing of my identity and who people see me to be and how I believe myself to be, and having a look at it outside of me helps me to understand sometimes where the problems come from, the history of them, what effects they have on me and my relationships. One of our colleagues used to speak about problems traveling in gangs. So there are a whole gang of problems that try and attach themselves to you, and how it then takes an act of resistance to really stand up to that and externalize them. And so whether it's learning to live with depression as the shadow, it's always with me in some form or fashion, but it now frees me to make different choices that stand outside of that story.
And I'm hearing the need for, even for me as a teacher, as a parent, as an uncle. Yeah, I'm just thinking there's a lot of room for even a little awareness of how we use language, how we use words, as you know, how we use language as parents. So in those moments of stress, when when we're stressed and we're not always in our most evolved, in our most evolved moments, and suddenly something comes along and you said, "I knew it! I knew you would do that because you're always like that."
Mm.
Um, yeah, I'm catching myself there, even just in the way that I communicate with people, that I do not totalize them, that I can separate, even no matter how upset, no matter how regressed I am in that moment, to bring that awareness continually. But I may not be pleased with this behavior, but this
Mm.
behavior is not the person, is not my
Mm.
child, is not my
Mm.
nephew, is not my niece.
Yeah. And so being
Yeah.
careful of how that single narrative could, I think it's Chimamanda Adichie that has a TED talk called the danger of a single narrative or single story. And it's exactly that, how that single story starts to define all of who I am, when perhaps it's just one small part.
I'm wondering, there might be somebody listening to us having this conversation and will be saying, well, that's all good until you meet my Johnny.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Uh, I'm just curious about what you would kind of invite a person like that who thinks, yeah, that's a good idea. That's really lovely. But my journey is my journey is not exactly that. My journey needs some hard talking to.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like a parent speaking.
Yeah, yeah.
And so nine times out of 10, when I've journeyed with children and teenagers, it's the narratives that their parents tell that bring them to therapy, more than it is about themselves. And so the minute the conversation becomes about, why do you think you're here? Um, then it's about, I'm listening to your story and not what your mom or your dad has said about you. And to engage that child as somebody who has stories of their own. And sometimes their behaviors, children's behaviors, come out of a need or an experience. And I don't think sometimes parents recognize that. And that's a generalization, which is also not necessarily helpful. But if parents took the time, I always said, when Courtney was a teenager first, and there were times I really didn't like her because the teenager was somebody who I was unfamiliar with. But it was very helpful for me to remind myself of my own experiences at that time and how I was seeking identity or needing to fit in with my peers, and how being aware of that invites me to ask questions differently. So what do you think you might like to do the next time a tantrum is in the room? Or how would you like me to respond the next time tantrum is in the room with you? And yeah, I think it liberates children, and children buy into the creativity of narrative work too. How can, I think it's a famous one that we've all, anybody who's studied narrative has read up on Michael White's work and David Epstein's work with children, and thinking of the one that just comes to mind of a child living with encopresis. And so externalizing, figuratively, sneaky poo, and recognizing that sneaky poo came at certain times when certain things were happening, eventually empowered that child to, well, how can you say no to sneaky poo? What might you need to do to keep him out of your bed at night, or and how being creative with externalization works so well with children. It's a gift to children to have an adult work creatively with them. And externalization does that.
Mm. Yeah, and if there's any parent who is listening to this today and in future as well, I think there's something here, and I'm saying this for myself as an uncle, in the way that I relate with, yeah, and there are those moments, they're really, really difficult moments when I am tired, I'm just coming back from work and I arrive and somebody else is doing whatever it is. Those are tempting moments to just want to snap. I'm just wondering whether I4CC has a training program for this kind of parenting. This because we're talking about it as a way of being in the world, allowing parents to have access to this way of being. Because when I look around, it is quite difficult to find parents because there's no manual for parenthood, and so we were talking earlier about how we live within dominant stories, and for most parents, we just playing back the tape that was given to us when were growing up. And this is how it gets into the space of corporal punishment, for example, in schools. I've heard people saying, well, I was beaten myself several times, but I turned out well. Now, I'm not by any means wanting to go into that kind of conversation. I think what I'm looking at is a dominant narrative for what parenting has to be like. And for most people, they are really struggling with that narrative of parenting, and they're struggling to find an alternative way. Yeah.
So we do have people within our team that are particularly passionate about journeying with parents and working with parents. So there would certainly be, well, we just haven't hosted any since lockdown, but we do have programs or workshops, conversation spaces to invite parents to think of parenting differently, because a lot of our parents today live up to the notion of being the perfect parent. I have to be my child's best friend. There's so many discourses around parenting, as you say. So just to start to have those conversations can initiate change.
Yeah, because being a parent is, even though for most people they sign up to be parents, but we don't. It's almost impossible to sign up for what kind of a child my child is going to be like, and I have and I have to access something. I have to access something to be the kind of parent that I really want. Um, and if there's any parent listening, please just contact I4CC. Find a way of reaching out to I4CC, and I4CC has got a broad team of people that someone in the team is going to reach out to you, and maybe even in collaboration with you, we can bring together groups of parents that are dealing with similar things as you are. So I'm just putting that out there. And Nikki, you earlier referred to witnessing teams or reflecting teams. I want you to just say a little bit about that as we move towards the end of the conversation,
Mm.
and largely the function of those reflective teams or witnessing
Mm.
teams.
Mm. So I think in this time of COVID, we've tried to call them, because most of them have been online during this time, of listening circles. So even though we're in little boxes on a screen, the idea is basically that we're in a circle together, sharing stories in a way that there's no advice given, there's no acknowledgement, no affirmation given. There's no directing of conversations, but it's a space where people get to share, for example, what it's like to be a minister. That was one of our circles. What it's like to be a minister or a pastor in this time of narrative. What are you struggling with? What are you learning? So asking those kind of questions, and then just making space for people to share. And we've done, that was really one of our key offerings during lockdown last year, was just to come alongside different groups of people experiencing, whether it was teachers or matrics last year, the first group of matrics that really experienced their matric year in lockdown, counselors, what are you struggling with right now? You know, just to create listening spaces where people's stories can be witnessed and acknowledged and become part of a collective story, in a sense.
And because in moments of crisis, it's quite easy for people to become invisible.
Mm.
Because everyone is in survival mode. So
Yeah.
everyone goes into their own cocoon. And so what I'm hearing here is that I4CC has created these intentional spaces where people's stories and people's experiences can be centered, spotlighted, and hopefully people can be seen, can be witnessed too.
Mm. And their stories then become part of a collective story. So sometimes I might experience it as if I'm the only one I think is going through any particular response to COVID. But once I start talking to others, then I'm able to start recognizing it's not just me. There are others that are in a similar situation, and what it would be like to listen to their stories and for them to listen to mine. So we're almost thickening a shared story in some way, with all the different elements, the different storytellers. And there's something about community that then evolves or is a product of those shared conversations. If I think of during this time how we forged quite a strong community with our reading group, or with folk living across the oceans, so that it's not just a South African story, it's a world story right now. And how can we listen and learn from one another?
Wow. I've got a few rapid fire questions. Are you ready to go there? I'm just
Yes, let's go for
curious
it.
before we do that. Maybe before we go there, I'm curious if there's anything that you really want to present in this conversation and we haven't given it a chance.
For the purposes of this conversation, I don't think so. I think we've kind of covered some of the influence of narrative in my life and the particular practices as well. So I think we're good. But if there are any questions out there, then people are welcome.
Yes, if you have a question in there, please, you can put it in in the chat at the moment, and then we'll come back. We've got a few more minutes before we close. And so here we go with rapid fire questions. Sweet or sour?
Sweet.
Sweet.
Mm.
I'll tell you a little story about sweet. Because I worked with a 102 years old woman in a care facility once. I think it's 3 years ago now. She was the oldest in that facility. And every time in her room, she had little sweets, and she would invite other other people in. And she says, I always wanted to give people who come to visit me something sweet, because they all need some sweetness in their lives.
So mine would be chocolate. Unashamedly chocolate.
Yeah. And tea or coffee?
I think people who know me would know the answer to that. Definitely coffee.
Dance or run?
Dancing.
Dancing. Mountains or sea?
Seaside.
Seaside.
Definitely sea.
Company or solo?
A balance of both. A balance of both is good for my soul.
Right. Lovely. We haven't got any questions coming in at the moment, so that's a good sign that, yeah, so that's a good sign. But is there?
No, I don't think
one
so.
Moment.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So I want to, as we come to the end of this conversation, I just want to deeply thank you, Nikki, for this opportunity. Not just for the purposes of the conversation, but there's something for me that has shifted. You know, something around making that decision and how to move towards the decision. That for me was huge, because it's one thing to dream about a life. It's another thing to embrace that life and to move in the direction of that life, move in the direction of my dreams. And for most people, our most beautiful lives are in our minds, and because we're too afraid to move in the direction of those dreams. So I'm really, really grateful for that. That I feel encouraged to take bold steps when I need to, and really take that move forward in the direction of the preferred story, my preferred life.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. This has been good.
Yeah. And thank you, everyone. And that's it for this episode of Conversations of Meaning. And thanks to Nikki, the co-founder of the Institute for Creative Conversations, I4CC in short. So the I4CC is curating these conversations for the rest of the year. Look out for more discussions, and thanks for listening. Thank you, Nikki, for joining me today to share your story and how we can sensitively engage with each other by applying narrative therapy ideas and practices. And please look out for another intriguing episode of Conversations of Meaning next month. Make sure not to miss out. Sign up to subscribe to our newsletter and all our social media platforms. Never miss an episode. And you can also get an annual registration by stopping by our website, www.i4cc.co.za.
Thank
So
you.
thank you very much, Nick. Good.
Thank you. It was good to see everybody. Enjoy the long weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.